Iborn, welcome to 10-Minute Talks. I'm Harshadeva. Today, I'm truly honored to welcome a distinguished scholar, Professor Gearóid Millar, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Aberdeen, whose work has significantly shaped how we understand peace building in practice. His research focuses on international conflict, transitional justice, and peace building, particularly how internationally designed projects are actually experienced by local communities in post conflict societies. Through his groundbreaking book, An Ethnographic Approach to Peace Building, he has helped shift the field towards listening more carefully to local voices and living realities. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for joining me today. My first question is, when we talk about the challenges to peace in 21st century, such as geopolitics, climate change, inequality, and even digital spaces and misinformation, what do you think is the most underestimated challenge, and why?
So all of the ones that you mentioned obviously are very, very important. Each of these though is getting a lot of attention, massive attention in the media, a lot of attention from scholars, academics, think tanks, and policymakers. What so there's a couple of things I think are being underappreciated maybe. The first thing I would say is that the interaction between these things is really, really addressed enough. And it does not seem to me like policymakers in particular are fully understanding the way that these various global challenges will interact with each other. So issues of climate change and inequality, for example, or mass mobilization and migration of people, right? We kind of, there's kind of sometimes a recognition of this, but we're not really addressing this challenge in any fundamental way, and it's substantial. It's a huge problem. So the fact that all these things are interacting is the first thing. But even the broader geopolitical issues and technology issues, communications issues, climate issues, even among those, even not talking about the interaction yet, there's still some things that are being really not addressed. So one of the things that is on my mind a lot that I think I don't see at all in the media, from politicians in their statements and discussions that seem to be high profile, is a recognition of the dangers of automation from AI, right? Particularly in areas of the world that have become the industrial kind of centers where everything is produced. So you have this real problem where millions upon millions, tens of millions of people in particularly East Asia, also parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, but particularly in East Asia, where people, tens of millions of people, left, their land from farms, from villages, went to cities that are now massive, mega industrial centers for jobs in factories to produce stuff, which AI and automation will probably in the next 5 or 10 years be able to do without those people. Those people don't have the rights to go back to the land. They can't go back to their farms. Nobody knows what will happen to these people. But in essence, it will become profitable, far more profitable to produce, because there will be far less costs, to produce these products that are being produced in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, in cities all over Southeast China, with automated technology and AI, far, far, far more cheaply than with people. Human labor, in essence, has nowhere to go in that kind of model, right? We've already, in essence, taken most of those people's land. They no longer have a right to return to those lands. Companies are using those lands. Governments, in some cases, are using those lands. And so they can't just go back to their villages, but there won't be other jobs for them. There may indeed be new careers framed somehow as AI jobs, but these will overwhelmingly be for elite, high-end professionals, likely not in those same places. So we are going to have a major problem here that brings together the issue of AI, of automation, of labor, of land rights, of inequality, that we barely talk about at all, right? So these are very much related to the demographic shifts that are happening, that are already happening, but that will be spurred on by new technologies in the future. So if I was to say there's kind of one thing that always pops into my mind that I don't see addressed really at all, it's we haven't thought through, none of the kind of AI godfathers who are out there, the billionaires who are now saying this is going to solve all of our problems, none of them seem to either be aware or to care or to have thought through the implications of AI and automation for actual physical livelihoods, right? We're always talking about what it might do for, finding new gene therapies. Okay, great. But like people making genes, that's, what about all the millions of people making toys? Once all of these things are automated, where are those people going to go? The other thing I think is a real problem is that we don't have, so the other thing I think we don't talk about enough is that there are no institutions tasked with thinking these things through. So there are think tanks that are independent, the Cascade Institute in Canada, for example, that are trying to think through the complex interactions between these dynamics. But what we've kind of set up over the last 70 or 80 years in the post-World War II period are these kind of different standalone institutions, an institution for international development, an institution for international labor rights, an institution for the climate, an institution for, and what institution brings them all together? At what point or at what fora do we talk about the interconnections between these challenges? And I don't think we have that. I don't think we have any organization pushing that forward. Instead, in kind of a neoliberal kind of environment, we have agendas that lobby groups have, or focus areas that particular international organizations have, human rights, for example, or food security. But we don't really have a place, kind of a global forum for thinking through in what way these things interact. And of course, all of that is being further undermined in the current climate where where kind of international cooperation as a whole is being undermined by the US's current positions. So that's answered question number one, I suppose. If I was to choose two things, it would be the lack of systems or institutions to look across these connections. And then the one biggest connection that I really fear nobody's keeping their eye on is kind of the downstream effects of AI on the labor markets.
Excellent. So, Professor, my second question is we often think of peace as something that comes after war, but your work suggests peace can and really must exist during war. How should we rethink what peace means when violence is still ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just my work. Obviously, there's a long history of looking at peace zones within conflict environments and looking at peace parks. But generally, there's, I think, far more recognition today of kind of the everyday nature of peace, even within violent contexts. And anybody, I suppose, there are indeed situations where violence and war becomes so extreme that it'd be hard to identify peace. But most of the conflicts we've seen in the last 50 years, even in Ukraine today, much of the country isn't experiencing bombings every night. Life goes on. Even in parts of the country that are experiencing sporadic attacks, children are still born and people still have jobs, and people get sick and go to hospitals, and much of that might be disrupted time to time by the violence, but we're in essence still living lives and getting by in a kind of heightened threat of violence situation. My parents, I was raised in Ireland in the 80s and the early 90s, and obviously cousins of mine, we were raised in Dublin, but cousins of mine were in Belfast. Their lives didn't stop. Their household lives, their jobs, their schooling, none of that stops just because every so often there's violence, very explicit violence, bombings and shootings and kidnappings and other things. So of course, we've known this for a long time. And the reality is that we really need to focus on the fact that, and kind of keep in our heads the fact that one of the things, for example, that peace and conflict studies as a field needs to be doing is thinking about how to support that kind of peace within conflict, right? Peace within violence. Develop resilience of communities, for example, within broader context that might be violent, but that communities, villages, towns, cities, neighborhoods can maintain peace for their own families or children, and maybe influence others and try to expand that over time. There have been lots of ways that this has been done in the past in conflict contexts, in settings of violence. We just don't really focus on them, and part of that is a disciplinary issue. So, it's far easier to be writing about kind of somewhere at war and then we can write it off as a place at war. And we forget that inside that war, people's lives go on, right? And everyday peace, the kind of peace that people form for themselves and their families and their neighborhoods and their communities, is still maintained. And one of the things that kind of peace and conflict studies or peace work practitioners could be doing more is trying to think through ways to support such everyday peace and make it more resilient in the face of violence that is very often of a higher scale, right? That's kind of regional or international or national. That doesn't mean, I'm not implying in any sense that kind of everyday peace can be some bulwark against violence and kind of a broader dynamics, or a big military can't just come in and squash that if they choose. Of course they can, but they often have no interest in doing so, right? Or they're kind of just passing these places by. Lots of peace exists within violence, just like, unfortunately, lots of violence exists within context supposedly of peace, right? And we know this. We just don't really talk about it very much.
Thank you, Professor. Lastly, let me ask this one. For people working on the ground, whether they are humanitarian workers, peace builders, or members of local communities, what does supportive peace actually looks like in everyday practice when the gun haven't gone silent yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very much related to the last answer, right? We have seen and we know that there are ways to support communities that are trying to defend their own safety, security, peace, even when, as you say, the guns have not fallen silent yet. The question, of course, as you note, is what can we do to support that? What can peace actors, peace workers, whether international or domestic, or religious organizations, NGOs, civil society, etc., what should they be doing to try to support that? And obviously that depends and differs depending on the context or the influence that that organization has. So if you were a religious organization or a peace-focused NGO inside the context, then you can do a lot more than, say, international NGOs outside. I'd say international organizations might be able to support, provide capacity, provide maybe manpower externally for things like grant writing or gaining resources, sending resources to people who are working on the ground trying to maintain this kind of form of everyday or community peace. But the extent to which external actors can really helpfully influence a local context is, has been massively questioned over the last 10 or 15 years, other than trying to be supportive, sending resources, sending funds, helping to gain more resources. It's hard to see the most obvious ways that international actors can support kind of, peace, everyday peace, community peace within the context. I think it is far more for local actors, religious organizations, NGOs, community groups, to be trying to support each other, trying to support any efforts towards peace within the context, and of course then to be reaching out to others outside the context for the kind of resources or capacity or training or advice that they need. As opposed to the other way around, the international is trying to tell the local what to do. It should be very much the other way around, where the local is trying to reach out to the international and ask for what's needed. That does require the international to be willing to listen, to be able to provide those kinds of resources or support or capacity, and that's an open question. Which kind of organizations are willing to do that? I do, in essence, think that in order to support kind of more community or everyday peace, we need much more empathy and effort to bring resilience to these kind of community efforts to form peace within contexts that are still experiencing violence. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much for your time and this thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate your insights and reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. Great questions, by the way. Thank you.